The truth about us, medics, and why the rules didn't always protect them. On an island called Iwo Jima in the winter of 1945, an American infantryman fell in the black volcanic sand. He was hit low in the belly and he could not stand. He did what every American infantryman in that war had been trained to do. He filled his lungs and he shouted for help. But he did not shout the word medic. He shouted doc. Because by the time American Marines waded ashore on Iwo Jima, they had learned. The word medic in English had become a Japanese sniper's cue. A trained ear in the tree line heard that one word and knew what was coming. Within seconds, a young man carrying a canvas bag would be running across open ground. A young man with no rifle. A young man who would not shoot back. A young man who was, in the calculation of the Japanese army, the highest value target on that beach. Kill an officer, and you eliminate one man. Kill a machine gunner, and you eliminate a weapon. Kill a medic, and you eliminate the survival of every wounded American within 100 yards. One bullet, 10 victories. 61 nations had signed a piece of paper in Geneva to prevent exactly this. They had promised these young men would never be targeted, that the red cross on their arms would be a shield. The paper meant nothing in the black sand of Iwo Jima. The paper meant something in the mud of France. Sometimes, on good days, when the Waffen-SS was not around. This is the story of what really happened to the men who carried the wounded. A young carpenter from Virginia who went to war without a rifle and saved 75 men on a cliff. A high school dropout from Washington who held a plasma bottle in one hand and a pistol in the other. A gentle giant from Pennsylvania who bled to death directing his fellow medics for 4 hours. And thousands more whose names no one will ever remember. 2 theaters, 2 opposite survival strategies, one promise that was broken in both. The plan on paper Geneva. 1929. A room full of men in dark suits, sitting at a long table. They had never held a rifle. They had never carried a stretcher. But that afternoon, they wrote a promise. The promise was simple. Any man who cared for the wounded, who bandaged, who stitched, who carried the dying out of the fire, that man would not be a soldier. He would be something else, something protected. He would wear a red cross on his left arm. He would not carry a weapon. He would walk into the killing, unarmed, and the killing would let him pass. 61 nations signed it. The United States signed it. Germany signed it. Italy signed it. Japan signed it too. The men in dark suits stood up. They shook hands. They believed they had done something. They had done nothing. The difference in the fine print. Every nation read the same document. Every nation read it differently. The Americans read the promise and heard a rule. If a medic carried a weapon, he lost his protection. So the American medic would carry no weapon, no pistol, no rifle, nothing. Not even a knife for self-defense. Just a bag, just bandages, just faith in a piece of paper. The Germans read the promise and heard a suggestion. A medic could carry a pistol, but only to defend himself, only to defend his patients. So many German medics went to war with a Walther P-38 on their hip. Small, practical, a last resort. The Japanese read the promise and heard nothing. They signed the Geneva Convention in 1929. They never ratified it. In the years that followed, their army was taught a different code. Bushido. A code that had no room for surrender. No room for prisoners. No room for the concept of a man who cared for the wounded as a man worth sparing. And so, before the first shot of the war was fired, the promise was already 3 different promises. And the men who would live and die by it, the medics, did not yet know which promise applied to them. The helmet that was never ordered. There is an image burned into the popular memory of the Second World War. A young American medic crawling through mud, a red cross painted on the front of his helmet. Big, bold, unmistakable. That helmet was never ordered. The United States War Department never issued a directive requiring medics to paint red crosses on their helmets. There was no manual, there was no standard, no pattern, no paint kit. Every Red Cross helmet you have ever seen in a photograph, everyone was painted by hand, by a medic, in the field. With paint he scrounged, borrowed, or stole. He painted it because he was afraid, because he had watched a friend get shot, because he thought perhaps if the cross were bigger, the enemy would see it in time. Some medics painted small crosses on tape and stuck them to their nets. Some painted enormous white circles with red crosses in the middle. Some painted the entire helmet white. Some painted crosses on all 4 sides. Some, after Normandy, even copied the German medical vests, sewing red crosses onto canvas tabards and wearing them over their uniforms. There was no rule, there was only fear, and there was only hope that fear, painted in red, might be enough. 3 men, 3 stories, 3 different wars. To understand what happened to American medics in the Second World War, you have to understand 3 men. They did not know each other. 2 of them would never meet. But their stories taken together tell the truth that the newsreels never told. The first man, Desmond Thomas Doss, was 23 years old when he enlisted. He was a shipyard joiner from Lynchburg, Virginia, working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard. His father was a carpenter. His childhood had been spent in the quiet rooms of the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was thin, quiet. He spoke with the soft, slow accent of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He believed the 10 Commandments were written in stone, and the 6th commandment was written for him, "Thou shalt not kill." He also believed his country needed him. He had been offered a deferment. His shipyard work was essential. He turned it down. On April 1st, 1942, at Camp Lee, Virginia, he raised his right hand and swore an oath with one condition. He would not carry a weapon. He would not kill, but he would go anywhere the army sent him. He would carry the wounded. He would save lives. The army sent him to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. His platoon called him a coward. They called him worse things than that. They threw boots at him while he prayed at night. They mocked his Bible. His sergeant made him drill on Saturdays, his Sabbath, because he refused to work on the day he considered holy. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, filed for his discharge under Section 8, mental unfitness. He wanted Doss gone. Officers threatened him with court-martial for refusing a direct order to bear arms. The man who would one day receive the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive it, spent the first year of his service watching the army try again and again to throw him out. Section 8 failed. Transfers failed. The threats did not break him. Then, one day, someone in the chain of command looked at the file. looked at DOS and decided the army needed men who ran toward the wounded more than it needed one more infantry rifle. The paperwork was set aside. DOS stayed. The second man, Robert Eugene Bush, was 17 years old when he dropped out of high school. He was from Raymond, Washington, a town of sawmills and logging trucks. His father had been a sawmill worker. His mother was a nurse. They had divorced when Bob was 4. He had grown up watching his mother stitch cuts and set broken fingers on the kitchen table. On January 5, 1944, he walked into a Navy recruiting office and asked to be a corpsman. He was still a boy. He had never fired a rifle. He had never held a scalpel. He had never seen a man die. He had never left the state of Washington. The Navy sent him to Hospital Corps School at Farragut, Idaho. Then to the Naval Hospital in Seattle. Then to the Field Medical Service School at Camp Pendleton in California, where the Marines taught the Navy's corpsmen how to survive alongside them, because that was the arrangement. The Marines did not have their own medics. The Navy loaned them corpsmen, and when a Marine went down screaming in the mud of some island no one had ever heard of, it was a Navy corpsman who ran to him. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, Robert Bush landed on the beaches of Okinawa. He was 18 years old. He had 31 days left before the moment that would define the rest of his life. The third man, Alfred Leonard Wilson, was 23 when the letter came. He was from Fairchance, Pennsylvania. His father had been a coal miner, then a timberman. His mother had died when Alfred was 14. He had 10 brothers and sisters. He had finished 1 year of high school. He had worked as a laborer. He was a big man, tall enough that the men in his detachment looked up when they spoke to him. He was gentle. He did not raise his voice, ever. In his medical detachment, his brothers called him things that were meant with love. Big Al Pap, Stoop, the gentle giant. He was drafted on February 15th, 1943. The army trained him as a medic, not because he asked, because that was where they needed him. He learned to inject morphine. He learned to close a sucking chest wound. He learned to look at a man's eyes and decide in 3 seconds whether that man could still be saved. He was assigned to the medical detachment of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division. By November of 1944, he was in Lorraine, in eastern France. The rain had turned the ground to soup. The wounded were coming in faster than they could be treated. He had 8 days left, 2 theaters, 2 enemies, 2 opposite survival strategies. To understand what happened to Doss and Bush and Wilson, and to the thousands of American medics whose names history did not remember, you have to understand this one fact. The war they fought was not one war. It was 2. In Europe, the American medic and the German medic knew the same secret. It was an unspoken bargain, written nowhere, enforced by nothing but mutual fear. It went like this: if you shoot my medic, I will shoot yours. If you leave mine alone, I will leave yours alone. Neither of us can afford to lose them. So let us pretend, in the middle of this killing, that these men are neutral. The bargain broke, often. There were exceptions. There were massacres. There were units like the Waffen-SS that honored no bargain, ever. But most of the time, on most of the front, the bargain held. American medics in Europe painted more red crosses on their helmets as the war went on. They waved Red Cross flags. They walked into open fields to collect the wounded. And most of them walked back out. In the Pacific, there was no bargain. The Japanese army had not just failed to ratify the Geneva Convention. They had actively decided, at the tactical level, that the American medic was the highest value target on the battlefield, higher than an officer, higher than a machine gunner, higher than a radioman. Because they had done the math. Kill an officer, you eliminate one man. Kill a machine gunner, you eliminate a weapon. Kill a medic, you eliminate the survival of every wounded American within 100 yards. You do not just kill one man, you kill 10. You break the morale of the platoon that watched him fall. You ensure that the next American who is hit will die screaming, alone in the mud. 1 bullet, 10 victories. In Europe, American medics survived by painting more red crosses on their uniforms, bigger, brighter, on every visible surface. In the Pacific, they survived by scraping every red cross off. The same symbol in 2 different oceans meant 2 opposite things. In one theater, it was a shield. In the other, it was a bullseye. And the men who wore it, Doss and Bush and Wilson and every corpsman whose name is carved on a stone somewhere, had to learn which theater they were in. They had to learn fast. Some of them learned in time. Some of them did not. Europe, the fragile bargain. It was raining in Lorraine. It had been raining for 11 days. The kind of rain that soaks through wool and stays there. The kind that turns foxholes into cold soup and turns the dead into shapes you cannot recognize. It was the 8th of November, 1944. Patton's Third Army was pushing east toward the German border. Every yard cost blood. Alfred Wilson, Big Al, the gentle giant of the 328th Infantry, was near a village called Bézange-la-Petite. He was 25 years old. He had been in France for 3 weeks. A runner came through the trees. A neighboring company was taking artillery. Their medic was down. They had wounded. Wilson did not have to go. He was assigned to a different company. His orders did not send him across those trees, but he stood up, picked up his bag, and went, because that was what medics did. He worked for hours. He crawled from man to man in the mud, cutting away uniforms, packing wounds, dragging bodies behind trees. The German artillery walked back and forth across the field like a man pacing in a room. 88s, 105s. Each shell made the ground jump. Then a runner came from his own company. His company was being shelled now. His men were falling. Wilson picked up his bag and turned back. He was running through the trees when a shell burst behind him. A fragment of steel smaller than a coin entered his back and passed through his chest. He did not fall. He kept running. He reached his company. There were men down. He knelt. He began to work. The other medics, the ones sent to relieve him, saw the blood soaking through his jacket. They saw the color leaving his face. They tried to put him on a stretcher. He waved them off. He did not have time. There were still men on the ground. For 4 hours, Alfred Wilson knelt in the mud of a French field, bleeding from a wound that should have killed him instantly. He directed the other medics. He told them which man to treat first. He handed them bandages from his own bag. He talked to the wounded softly, in that quiet Pennsylvania voice, telling them they were going to be all right, telling them help was coming, telling them to hold on. He kept working until he could no longer hold himself upright. Then he lay down beside the man he had been treating. He did not speak again. He died the next morning. The Medal of Honor citation would say later that Corporal Wilson saved at least 10 lives that day. It would not say that he was the only Medal of Honor recipient from Fayette County, Pennsylvania, in the entire Second World War. It would not say that his story would be nearly forgotten for 50 years, until his niece, a woman named Carolyn McKinney, began asking questions. Alfred Wilson's Medal of Honor was not awarded until June 18, 1945, 7 months after he died. His father, a coal miner from Fairchance, Pennsylvania, who had already buried his wife, and now his son, received the medal in his son's place. In a small ceremony, in a small town, in a country that was already trying to forget the war, the witnesses of Europe. The bargain in Europe held most of the time. But every American medic who served on the Western Front carried a story that proved the bargain was breaking. There was John Birch, a medic with the 99th General Hospital. He was in the Ardennes in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the largest American engagement of the war. His commander received a visit from a general a man Birch would only ever describe as the general of the 101st. The general said this. He said he could not order the medics to carry weapons, but he strongly advised it. So Birch and his men taped over the red crosses on their helmets. They hid their armbands. They were issued pistols. They did not know how to use them. We didn't really know how to fire them, Birch remembered, decades later. But we never put on our red crosses again. There was Ted Clay of the 321st Medical Battalion, sitting in the open, treating a wounded man. Red crosses on both sides of his helmet. Bright, visible, undeniable. A German rifle cracked. A round missed him by inches. Clay looked up. Somewhere in the tree line, a man was aiming at him. Aiming at him. Not near him. At him, he lay down flat beside the wounded man. He waited. The sniper fired again and again, waiting for Clay to sit up. Eventually, the sniper gave up, or moved on, or ran out of daylight. Clay sat up. He finished treating the wounded man. He carried him back to the aid station. We were targeted, he would say later. I know that for a fact. There was Kresto Mosuvic of the 99th Infantry Division. In the snow of the Ardennes, he watched an American sergeant named Blake put 2 bullets into a German medic. The German had a pistol on his belt. He was standing next to a dead man, muttering, either shocked or unhinged. Blake did not wait to find out. He fired. The German fell. And in the next moment, the German mortar fire that had been raining down on the American position stopped, because the man Blake had shot had not been a medic at all. He had been a spotter, or perhaps he had been a medic. And the pistol on his hip, the pistol the Germans said was for self-defense, only had made him look like something else. That was the tragedy of the bargain in Europe. It was written on paper. It was enforced in the mud. And in the mud, in the snow, in the smoke, a medic with a pistol was not always a medic. And a soldier, looking down the barrel of a rifle at a shape 200 yards away, did not always have time to know the difference. There was Dwayne Pinkston of the 82nd Airborne. He was asked once why he never painted red crosses on his helmet. He gave the shortest answer any medic ever gave. We didn't wear one, he said. We figured it was too good a target. The Pacific, where the cross was a coffin. In Europe, the bargain broke sometimes. In the Pacific, there had never been a bargain. The men who landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942 were the first to learn. The men who landed on Tarawa in November of 1943 learned again. And by the time American Marines were wading through the surf at Peleliu in September of 44, the lesson had been written in the blood of a generation of Navy corpsmen. The lesson was this: the Japanese army did not respect the Red Cross. The Japanese army hunted the Red Cross. "We had to carry weapons," said Rich Vallon, a Navy corpsman, "because the Japanese don't care about the Red Cross at all. They pay no attention to that. In fact, they'd rather kill you because they know you're going to prolong life by saving lives. And we did not wear a red cross on our helmet. The reason they don't put a red cross on you," said Greg Emery, another corpsman, "is because the Red Cross became only a target for the Japanese gunners." "Well, as a medic, I wasn't supposed to be armed," said Dwight Carter. "But the Japanese didn't recognize that. So we had a carbine, a .30 caliber carbine that I had with me at all times." "Did you ever fire it?" the interviewer asked, decades later. Carter shook his head. "I was busy taking care of people. That was the pattern. Every corpsman in the Pacific carried a weapon. Almost none of them fired it. Because in the moment when the shooting started, when the wounded began to scream corpsman, a corpsman had a choice. He could shoot back, or he could work. Almost every one of them chose to work. I never fired them in combat," said Sidney Savage of the 145th Infantry, "because people were falling all around me." Charles Crawford was one of the few who did fire. He had a Colt 45 and a carbine. He tried to hit Japanese soldiers moving on the ridge ahead of him. He was not sure if he ever succeeded. "The distance was something else," he said. "You couldn't tell whether you had hit or subdued a Japanese soldier or anything. They stopped shouting the word. By the middle of the Pacific War, no American infantryman on any island shouted medic anymore. They shouted doc, because medic in English had become a Japanese sniper's cue. A trained ear in the tree line heard the word and knew that within seconds a man with a canvas bag would be running through open ground toward a wounded American. A man who could not shoot back. A man who would not shoot back. There were reports, never fully confirmed, but repeated by too many veterans to dismiss, of Japanese soldiers shouting the word themselves, in English, to lure corpsmen into the open. Some accounts described wounded American soldiers being used as bait, left alive, screaming, in the middle of a clearing, waiting for the corpsman to come. The corpsmen came anyway. They did not just strip the crosses from their helmets. They stripped everything. The double-strap medical yoke, the harness that carried 2 medical bags across the chest, was abandoned in the Pacific. Because a Japanese sniper could recognize it from 100 yards away, corpsmen switched to a single small bag, worn low on the hip, invisible from the front. They stopped shaving in the field because the freshly shaved face of a corpsman looked different from the bearded face of an infantryman. Some of them learned the specific hand signals of the Marine rifle squads they served with, so their movements would not give them away. They did everything, at every level, to disappear, to not be a medic, to not be seen. At Iwo Jima, in February and March of 1945, The Navy sent approximately 2,500 hospital corpsmen ashore with the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. In the 36 days of fighting that followed, 332 of them were killed in action or died of wounds. 659 more were wounded and had to be evacuated. In 6 battalions, the corpsman casualty rate exceeded 50%. In 1 battalion, it was 68%. They were being killed faster than the men they were trying to save. The Cliff Hacksaw Ridge, the 77th Infantry Division, landed on Okinawa on the 29th of April, 1945. Ahead of them was a ridge. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese called it the Maeda Escarpment. It was a cliff of coral limestone, 400 feet high, rising almost vertically out of the surrounding fields. At the top was a plateau. On that plateau, dug into caves and tunnels, the Americans had not yet discovered, were 3,000 Japanese soldiers. The only way up was a cargo net, thrown over the edge, secured to the top by earlier climbing parties. For 3 days, the 77th tried to take the ridge. For 3 days, they were driven back down. Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry. Desmond Doss's company was gutted. A third of the men in his platoon were gone. Doss was 26 years old. He carried no weapon. He wore no Red Cross. He had learned, in the jungles of Guam the year before, and in the mud of Leyte the year before that, what Red Crosses meant in the Pacific. He carried a small canvas bag, a morphine kit, bandages, plasma, a small Bible in his breast pocket, given to him by his wife Dorothy the day before he shipped out. On the morning of May 5th, 1945, Company B was ordered to attack the ridge again. May 5th was a Saturday. For Desmond Doss, Saturday was the Sabbath. It was a day he did not work. It was a day he did not eat, unless he had prepared his food the night before. It was a day he spent, when he could, in prayer. He did not have to go up the cliff that day. He asked his captain for a few minutes to pray. The captain gave them to him. When Doss came back down from the ridge to where his company was forming up, he told his captain he was ready. They went up the net. They reached the top. They pushed forward across the plateau. And then, from every hidden tunnel entrance, from every cave, from every fold in the coral, the Japanese counterattacked. The company broke. The men who could still move began pulling back to the edge of the cliff. The men who could not move, the wounded, were left where they had fallen. There were 75 of them. The able-bodied began climbing back down the net. Command called for artillery. Doss was told to fall back with the rest. He did not fall back. He turned around and walked back onto the plateau, alone. For the next 12 hours, Desmond Doss did not stop. He crawled from one wounded man to the next, across ground still till a Japanese fire. When he found a man alive, he dragged him, sometimes carried him to the edge of the cliff. He had in his bag a length of rope. He had learned, as a boy in Virginia, how to tie a bowline, a knot that would not slip, a knot that would hold. He tied the bowline around the wounded man. He looped the rope around a tree stump at the cliff's edge, and one by one he lowered them down. 400 feet, in the dark, under fire, alone. While he worked, he whispered a prayer. He said it under his breath, over and over, so quietly that only the man he was lowering could hear. Lord, please help me get one more. That was all. Just that. Please help me get one more. Doss stood on that plateau for 12 hours, upright, unarmed, in plain view. He wore no armor. He wore no red cross. He was, by every calculation of that battlefield, a man who should have been dead within minutes. He was not shot. Not once. Japanese soldiers captured after the war were asked about it. Some of them said they had seen him. Some said their rifles had jammed. Some said their sights had failed. Some said, without explanation, that they had aimed at him and simply missed. Doss believed it was God. Historians have never been able to explain it. It is one of the few things in the recorded history of the Second World War for which there is no satisfactory answer. He should have died. He did not die. He got one more, and then one more, and then one more. The official count, later confirmed by his commanding officer and reviewed by the army, was 75 men. 75 men who would have been left on that plateau to die. 75 men who went home to wives and children and mothers because a Seventh-day Adventist shipyard joiner from Lynchburg, Virginia, refused to leave them. The corpsman on Awacha Pocket. While Doss was on the cliff, a Navy corpsman named Robert Bush was on a hill 9 miles to the south. Bush was 18 years old. He had landed on Okinawa on Easter Sunday. He had been in combat for exactly 1 month. On the 2nd of May, 1945, his rifle company, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, was attacking a ridge called Awacha Pocket. The company took the top. Then a Marine officer, a lieutenant named Roach, went down badly wounded on the exposed skyline of the ridge. Bush ran to him. He knelt on the open ground. He pulled a bottle of blood plasma from his bag. He hung it from a stick. Jammed into the coral, he began the transfusion. The plasma was still dripping when the Japanese counterattacked. They came up over the ridge in a wave, screaming, firing. Bush did not run. He could not run. The plasma line was in the officer's arm. If he pulled it, the officer would die. So he did the only thing he could do. He held the plasma bottle up with his left hand. With his right, he drew his Colt .45 pistol. He began firing. The pistol emptied. He dropped it. He grabbed a carbine from the ground beside a dead Marine. He fired that too. 3 grenades exploded near him in a matter of seconds. Fragments tore into his body. One of them entered his right eye and destroyed it. He got shrapnel in his shoulders. He got fragments in his left eye. He kept firing. He would tell a reporter, decades later, exactly what he had done. Every time I saw a Japanese head pop up, he said, I could see the star on their helmets. I'd fire 1 round a foot below where I saw that head come up. Because I knew I couldn't miss. I'd get 'em on the way down. He killed 6. The plasma bottle stayed up. The Marine officer lived. Bush lived too barely. He was carried off the ridge with half his face bandaged and his uniform soaked in his own blood and the blood of the man he had saved. Robert Bush was 18 years old. He had never finished high school. He had never held a job outside a sawmill. In 5 months, he would stand at the White House in a new uniform with a bandage still covering his right eye, and President Harry Truman would place the Medal of Honor around his neck. He would become the youngest Navy corpsman in the history of the United States to receive it. He would go home. He would finish high school in 1946. He would go to college. He would build a lumber company that would eventually be worth millions of dollars. He would raise 4 children. He would live to be 79 years old. He would wear a glass eye for the rest of his life. He would never speak of the 18-year-old boy who lost it, without also speaking of Lieutenant Roach, who lived, the sniper on the ridge, 3 weeks after the cliff. On the 21st of May, 1945, Desmond Doss was still on Okinawa. The 77th Division had pushed south. The Japanese were falling back to the Shuri line. It was raining again. It had been raining for days. The mud on Okinawa was a red-brown paste that clung to everything and washed away nothing. Doss was moving with his company through a rice paddy when a grenade landed near his feet. He tried to kick it away. He was too late. It exploded. 17 fragments of shrapnel entered his legs. He crawled to cover. He waited for the stretcher bearers. When they came, he saw another wounded man, a man wounded worse than he was. And he rolled off the stretcher and told them to take the other man first. He lay in the mud. He waited for the second stretcher. While he was waiting, a Japanese sniper, somewhere in the trees, perhaps 200 meters away, put a bullet through his left arm. The bullet shattered the bone. Doss did not scream. He was, by then, a man who had seen too much to scream. He found a rifle stock in the mud beside him. He splintered it. He used it to splint his own arm. Then he began to crawl. 300 yards. Through the mud. Under fire. Toward the American lines. Somewhere on that crawl, he lost the small Bible from his breast pocket. The Bible his wife Dorothy had given him. The Bible he had carried in Guam, in Leyte. On the cliff, he did not know it was gone until he reached the aid station. When he told his battalion that the Bible was lost, his battalion, the same men who had thrown boots at him at Fort Jackson, the men who had called him coward, went back onto the battlefield. Every man who could still walk. In the rain, under fire, they found the Bible. They brought it back to him. The White House. The war ended on a Sunday morning in September. The papers were signed on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur watched the Japanese delegation file forward. He said what he had been rehearsing to say. The war was over. The killing was over. The world was allowed, for the first time in 6 years, to exhale. But there were still ceremonies to hold. There were still medals to give. There were still names to speak into the record before the country turned its face away from the war and toward the long, quiet business of forgetting. On the 5th of October, 1945, 13 Navy and Marine Corps veterans stood in a receiving line on the south lawn of the White House. The lawn was still green. The sky was clear. It was a warm afternoon in Washington. The president walked down the line. Harry Truman had been in office for less than 6 months. He had inherited the atomic bomb. He had inherited the end of the war. He was a plain-spoken man from Missouri, and he did not enjoy ceremonies of this kind, but he did them because they had to be done. He stopped in front of a young man in a Navy uniform. Robert Bush was 19 years old, just barely. His 19th birthday had been the day before. He was still on his honeymoon. He had married a girl from Washington named Wanda Spooner. 3 weeks earlier, he had a bandage over his right eye. Under the bandage was an empty socket. He had not yet been fitted for a glass eye. His hair had grown back over the scar where the grenade fragment had entered his skull. He was so thin that his uniform hung loose on his shoulders. Truman said something to him. There is no recording of what he said. It was too quiet. But witnesses remembered that Truman held Bush's hand for a long time, longer than protocol required, long enough that the aide behind the president cleared his throat. Then Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Bush's neck. Bush was the youngest Navy man in the entire Second World War to receive it. He would say, for the rest of his life, that the medal did not belong to him, that it belonged to the Marine lieutenant he had kept alive on the ridge at Awacha Pocket while the plasma dripped and the fragments tore. He would say the medal was for the men who did not come home. He would say it, and he would mean it, and no one who ever met him would doubt for a moment that he meant it. The second ceremony, 1 week later, on the 12th of October, 1945, a different man stood in the East Room of the White House. Desmond Doss was 26 years old. His left arm was in a sling. There were still surgical scars healing on his legs. He was thin, thinner than he had been in the army, thinner than the men in his old company would have recognized. The tuberculosis he had contracted on Leyte was already inside him. He did not know it yet. Neither did the army doctors. He was not comfortable in the East Room. He had never been comfortable in rooms with high ceilings and important people. He had been a shipyard joiner before the war. He would want to work with his hands after it. Standing at attention in a room full of generals was not, and would never be, his natural condition. Truman came down the line. The president stopped in front of Doss and looked at him for a long moment. Then he took the medal from the aide's tray and held it up. He said something. There is a recording of this one. I'm proud of you, Truman said. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president. Doss did not know what to say. He nodded. Truman placed the medal around his neck. Desmond Doss became, in that instant, the first conscientious objector in the history of the United States to receive the Medal of Honor. He had gone to war without a weapon. He had come home without ever having fired one. He had refused, on religious principle, to take a single human life, and he had saved 75. The photographers moved in. The bulbs flashed. Doss blinked into the light. Somewhere in the crowd of spectators, the wives, the officials, the guests, was a young woman with dark hair. Dorothy Chute Doss. She had married him in 1942. She had given him the Bible he had lost on Okinawa. She had not seen him in almost 2 years. He found her in the crowd. He walked to her. He did not salute anyone on the way. The third medal. There was a third ceremony. It happened before the other two. It happened in Fairchance, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1945. There was no White House. There was no president. There was a small stage set up outside a coal mining town, and there was an army officer in a dress uniform, and there was a man in his 60s with the calloused hands of a lifetime spent underground. Alfred Wilson's father had buried his wife when Alfred was 14. He had raised 11 children on a coal miner's wages. He had said goodbye to Alfred at a train station in 1943. He had received the telegram in November of 44. Now, on a summer afternoon 8 months later, an army officer read a citation aloud in front of a small crowd. The citation described a medic who had refused evacuation while bleeding to death from a mortar fragment. A medic who had directed his fellow medics for 4 hours while lying in the mud of a French field. A medic who had saved at least 10 men. The officer stopped reading. He turned to Alfred's father. He handed him the Medal of Honor. Alfred's father took it in his coal-blackened hands. He did not weep in public. He did not make a speech. He nodded once. He put the medal in his pocket. He walked home. The medal would sit in a drawer for decades. It would be shown, occasionally, to nieces and nephews. Alfred's story would fade. 50 years would pass before his niece, a woman named Carolyn McKinney, who had never met her uncle, began asking questions. Before she tracked down the surviving men of the 328th Infantry, before she wrote his story down so that it would not disappear entirely. He is buried in Maple Grove Cemetery in Fairchance, Pennsylvania, beside his mother, a short walk from the coal seams where his father spent his life. The meeting that history does not record. Sometime after the war, no one is certain of the year, no one is certain of the city. Desmond Doss and Robert Bush met. It was probably at a gathering of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. It might have been a reunion. It might have been a private meeting between two men who had both been medics on Okinawa in the spring of 1945 and who had recognized each other's names in the newspapers. Bush was in his 20s by then. He had a glass eye. He wore it well enough that people who did not know him could not always tell. He had finished high school. He was building the lumber company that would eventually make him a wealthy man. Doss was still thin. The tuberculosis had taken his left lung by then. 5 of his ribs had been removed. He spoke slowly when he spoke at all. He had gone home to Virginia and then to Georgia and had tried, without complete success, to disappear. The two men shook hands. Bush told Doss the sentence that would follow him the rest of his life, the same sentence he told every reporter who ever asked him how he survived a Watcher pocket. With the help of God, he said, and a few Marines, I got through. Doss thought about it for a moment. He understood what Bush meant. He had done the same thing on the same island 3 days later, without the Marines. They did not talk for very long. Neither of them was a talker. But the men who saw it happen said afterward that they had never seen two strangers meet who understood each other so completely, or so quickly, or with so few words. There is no photograph of that meeting. There is no transcript. There is only the memory of the men who were there, and the memory of 2 old soldiers who, both in their own ways, had spent the rest of their lives trying to be worthy of what they had done when they were young. The numbers. There are numbers in the archives of the Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. They are dry. They are precise. They should be spoken slowly. During the Second World War, 889 Navy hospital corpsmen were mortally wounded. Thousands more were wounded and survived. The total corpsman casualty list from that war ran to more than 1,700 names. The Army's numbers are harder to pin down. But thousands of American combat medics, the young men with the canvas bags and the morphine kits, and, more often than not, no Red Cross on their helmets, were killed in the same war. In many units, the casualty rate for medics was 1.5 to 2 times higher than the casualty rate for the infantrymen they served. Approximately 11 American medics and hospital corpsmen received the Medal of Honor in the entire Second World War. 11. For a war in which more than 3.5 million men served in the medical branches of the United States military. Every other medic, every one of the millions who did not receive a medal, and every one of the thousands who did not come home did something that will never be recorded. They knelt beside a dying friend. They spoke softly to a boy from Ohio or Alabama or Oregon who was calling for his mother. They packed a wound they knew would not heal. They wrote a letter to a family they had never met, describing the last words of a son they had known for 6 hours. They did it in the mud of Berzang-la-Petite. They did it on the beaches of Tarawa. They did it in the caves of Peleliu and the snow of the Ardennes and the black sand of Iwo Jima and the rice paddies of Okinawa. They did it in field hospitals in England and aid stations in Italy and landing craft in the Pacific. They did it, most of them, without a Red Cross, without a weapon, without a witness. They did it because someone had to. What happened to the 3 of them? Alfred Wilson never came home. He is still in the ground in Pennsylvania. His name is on a small stone. Beside his mother's, Robert Bush came home. He had already married Wanda Spooner in September of 1945. He finished high school the next year. He earned a business degree from the University of Washington in 1950. He built the lumber company. He raised 4 children. He became president of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society from 1971 to 1973, the first Navy recipient in the history of that office. He died on the 8th of November, 2005. He was 79 years old. He is buried in Fern Hill Cemetery in Menlo, Washington. Desmond Doss came home too. He came home with tuberculosis. He came home with a shattered arm that never fully healed. He came home with hearing that would fail him in 1976, after an overdose of antibiotics that the doctors had thought would save his life. He and Dorothy moved to a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia, in the middle of the 1950s. He wanted to be a carpenter like his father, but his lungs would not let him. He worked at what he could. He raised a son. He read his Bible. He turned down every offer to make his story into a movie for almost 50 years. He did not speak in public if he could help it. He did not think of himself as a hero. When asked, he would say that the Lord had used him. Nothing more. He agreed, at the end of his life, to allow a documentary. The film was made in 2004. He watched it once. He did not comment on it. 12 years later, in 2016, a film called Hacksaw Ridge would tell his story to millions of people who had never heard his name. He would not live to see it. Dorothy died first. It was the 17th of November, 1991. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer years earlier, had been through surgery, had been in remission, then had been hit again. On that morning, Desmond was driving her to the hospital for treatment. The car went off the road, less than a mile from their home on Lookout Mountain. It rolled down an embankment. Dorothy died in the wreck. She was 70 years old. Desmond remarried in 1993 to a woman named Frances Duman, who cared for him in his last years. He died on the 23rd of March, 2006, at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He is buried in Chattanooga National Cemetery. His grave is simple. It is marked with a small white stone, like the graves of every other veteran around him. If you did not know who he was, you would walk past it without stopping. The last word. There is one more voice to hear. His name was Sidney Savage. He was an army medic with the 145th Infantry Regiment in the Pacific. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary medic. He did not receive the Medal of Honor. He did not do anything that history would remember specifically. He served, he came home, he grew old. Late in his life, an interviewer asked him what it had been like, what he did day to day, what the work had actually been. Sidney Savage was quiet for a while. Then he answered, "I would be patching them up," he said, knowing they weren't going to live, but talking to them all the time as though they were. He paused. "These were guys you laughed with in the morning and buried at night." That was all he said. He did not add anything to it. He did not need to. What the rules never promised. The Geneva Convention was written in a room full of men in dark suits, sitting at a long table in 1929. They wrote a promise on paper. They believed the promise would hold. It did not hold. Not in Europe, where it broke sometimes. Not in the Pacific, where it never existed at all. The men who wore the Red Cross and the men who scraped it off the medics of the United States Army and the corpsmen of the United States Navy, they learned within weeks of landing that the rules the world had signed did not always protect them. They did the work anyway. Alfred Wilson bled to death, directing other medics for 4 hours in a French field, and he did the work. Robert Bush held a plasma bottle in one hand and fired a pistol with the other, and he did the work. Desmond Doss stood on a cliff in Okinawa for 12 hours, whispering, "Lord, please help me get one more," and he did the work. Ted Clay lay flat beside a wounded man while a German sniper waited for him to sit up, and when the sniper gave up, he sat up and he did the work. Sidney Savage patched up boys who were already dying, and he talked to them like they were going to live, and he did the work. They did not do it because the paper told them to. They did not do it because they were promised protection. They did not do it for medals, or for parades, or for the ceremonies at the White House that most of them would never see. They did it because someone had to. They made a promise the Geneva Convention never made. Not a promise between nations. A promise between a dying man and a living one. The promise was the same in every language, in every theater, in every mud-filled foxhole, and every field of black sand, and an American medic knelt down beside a wounded friend. "I am here. I will not leave you. Just one more.